Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday's episode of the Rugby Bunker. No podcast, just the YouTube special. And thank you, firstly, for watching our Lee Blackett episode on Friday, where Charlie and I broke down what we can expect from the new permanent attack coach of England moving forward. What we're going to have now is something a little different. We're going to be chatting to Tim Percival, who is the media officer for the England men's rugby team, who runs their communications. But he's also written a book about the media. It's called On the Record and On the Ball, How Elite Coaches Master the Media. So I'm going to be asking him a few things about the chapters that are in there, plus a few things he's experienced in his many years working in comms with Northampton and with England, and starting out with Wasps in his first ever role. Hope you enjoy. Charlie and I will be back on Friday for a bit of a Premiership preview where we're going to pick our Premiership table. Look forward to a bit of debate around that, and we'll be able to chat about those games. We'll also have a big preview for the Women's Rugby World Cup final as well. Enjoy. Delighted to be joined on the Rugby Bunker by Tim Percival, who is the media officer for England Rugby. But Tim, you're here in another capacity today because you've written a book, and I'm very excited to hear all about it. Can you tell me what it's called?
Yeah, it's called, hi Ben, yeah, thanks for having me on. It's called On the Record and On the Ball, How Elite Coaches Master the Media. And it was out on the 28th of August, and I'm grateful for you having me on to talk about it.
I can't believe you had a copy just there and available to hand. That's incredibly fortunate.
Yeah, look, it took me about 3 years to write. I started writing it when I had I had a kind of my newborn baby, my son. He was born about 3 years ago, and I started writing it then. He used to get up really super early in the mornings, and I was up. I mean, sometimes before it was light. So I was sitting there watching kind of reruns of Breaking Bad and realizing that I probably should be using my time a bit better. So I started researching the book then, and so he was the catalyst really for me to kind of write it. And I'm glad I did, because it was a much better use of my time than watching Breaking Bad again.
What was the inspiration behind it, and maybe give us a bit of background into how long you've sort of been in the industry on the comms side of things?
To be honest with you, I just thought it was a book that people would like to read, and that kind of relationship between kind of top level sport and coaches and athletes. And I don't think there's an enormous amount of books out there that kind of cover that topic. So that was the main driver. And also that, that it tends to be a kind of misunderstood relationship, that one. So it was a way of me trying to kind of bring those two sides together. And then my background is I've worked in kind of communications for all of my career. And it wasn't until really I worked for a kind of sports agencies until about 2014. And then I ended up working for Wasps, which was my first job in rugby. And I helped do some of the communications around the move to the Ricoh Arena. And then from there, I ended up working for England under Eddie Jones for a couple of years. Then I went to Northampton Saints as a director there for 5 years. And in that time, I did the Lions tour as head of comms for 2021 series. And then just before the World Cup in 23, so last year, but it's not, it's 2 years ago, I went back to England to do the kind of media officer's role.
That switch from sort of the corporate world into a sports world. Talk me through that and what that was like.
Well, I suppose when you work for a kind of sports marketing agency, as I did until I worked for Wasps, it's very much kind of brand focused. You're kind of in and around sport, not necessarily at the real heart of it. And then when you take a team job, you really become right at the heart of the kind of performance bit of it. And I suppose my roles up until that point, I'd been working for kind of sponsors and in the kind of corporate side of things, in administration and governance and so on and so forth, but never right at the heart of the team. And I love the team roles, hence why I wrote the book. And I've kind of done that ever since. And I absolutely love it because you're just right at the heart of the sport there.
I know you said it took you 3 years to kind of put together. I wondered which parts of it surprised you the most when you were researching different topics and when you were chatting to people about it.
There was a few things that surprised me. I suppose one thing that surprised me was just quite how much I learned, because that was probably one of the most rewarding bits. And as I say, I was surprised by some of it. One of the things that I learned about was this thing called linguistic convergence. Basically, when people subconsciously mimic the speech patterns and of the kind of environments they inhabit. And a really obvious example of that is when you go to like Australia for a year and you come back with a slight Australian twang in your accent. That is linguistic convergence. You're developing and you're trying to you subconsciously mimic the speech styles of the environment around you, and part of that is your motivation to do that is to kind of fit in, and it can explain things like coach speak, where coaches end up kind of all sounding a bit the same, and coming out with the kind of same platitudes. That was one thing that I learned, and one really obvious example of that is when Steve McLaren was manager of FC20, just after he left the England job, and he gave a press conference in Holland, and he had that kind of Dutch twang to his voice. That's linguistic convergence, and he got hammered for that, and I thought it was really unfair, because ultimately, subconsciously, all he's trying to do is just fit in with his kind of new supporter base and the people around him. But he obviously got hammered for it, for sounding Dutch.
I think we haven't heard a lot of sympathy for him in that situation, but certainly it feels like your book and your explanation will help people kind of get a better understanding of that.
Yeah, I hope so, because as I say, I don't know him and never met him, if you see what I mean, but he comes across as a warm and likable bloke, and in that scenario, all he's trying to do, I know he got ridiculed and it went viral and it got clipped up and people took the mickey, but all he's trying to do there is kind of fit in, and that is one subconscious way that happens. But it's quite funny as well.
Yeah, there is definitely an element of that. I wanted to ask you, obviously a huge part of the industry, from my side as a journalist and from your side as a press officer, kind of revolves around team leaks and information getting out there, and you talk in the book about how sometimes that happens kind of deliberately because people are trying to get information, and sometimes it happens kind of accidentally, where somebody will be walking past a room in a hotel where a door's been left open and they'll see something on a whiteboard. I'm just fascinated to hear about kind of your take on that from someone who's sort of someone with the information who often is maybe trying to avoid it getting out.
Yeah. Well, like, first of all, like, leaks do frustrate coaches and administrators. I mean, because one of the bases of a high performance environment is one of the foundations is kind of confidentiality, and that's important, and it does frustrate coaches, particularly when it's around team selection, any kind of tactics, anything like that. So I think most coaches are at peace if it's a small piece of information, but if it's a big tactical change or there's a huge selection call and that leaks in the papers, that just really, really frustrates coaches, because they think it helps the opposition prepare for the game ahead of time. But on the flip side to that, the media want to write tomorrow's news today, and that's their role. And I think there's a kind of general understanding that there's going to be a clash of agenda there. I wrote a big chapter on this in my book. It's one of the most entertaining chapters in the book, actually. And I remember speaking to Andy Strauss for it, and he told me that when he was director of cricket at the ECB and they announced Trevor Bayliss, they managed to keep that confidential right up until the point where they announced it, and he felt very strongly that it should. And I asked him how he did that, and he basically said the circle of people who knew about that decision was very, very, very small, and in order to get something out, your circle has to be small. But that does put you in a position with your colleagues that you're effectively saying to your colleagues, "I don't trust you," which can be quite uncomfortable. So, yeah, I think the kind of general rule is, if you are going to keep anything, what I kind of concluded was, if you are going to keep anything away from the media, people privy to that information has to be absolutely minuscule. And can I just tell you about one story that's in that book that Charlie Sale, the kind of stalwart Daily Mail writer, told me, which I thought was great, was from 2014 World Cup. Football World Cup. England had got a training base under Roy Hodgson in Rio de Janeiro, which was in the kind of shadows of Sugarloaf Mountain. And Charlie told me as part of the book that some journalists would go up the cable car, and they realised that halfway along the cable car Sugarloaf Mountain, they could see about 2/3 of the England training ground. So they went up there with binoculars just to try and see if they could see, who was training or what the formations were. So I think journalists will go to great lengths to try and break that team news. And, it's important for their readers to read stuff and to sell newspapers. And I think coaches are aware of that. But it does put you on a bit of a collision course.
I was going to say that's given me inspiration for future kind of training camps and tournaments, but I don't want to play my hand. Yeah, I don't want to reveal any kind of future tactics that I might have. The next thing I wanted to ask about is something we've often spoken about when we've been chatting about coverage in your many roles, and how occasionally or quite often it is the kind of negative story which unfortunately can command so much more attention than an excellent interview or a feature or something historical. I wondered, I know personally how often that can seem quite frustrating if you put a lot into something very, very worthwhile and very good, and then some story along a different narrative break. So I wonder what it's like from your side as well, kind of managing the bad news versus good news.
Well, so there's a universal truth in journalism, isn't there, that bad news makes great news. And I'll give you an example of that. And again, I write this in the book. Is that I was talking to a journalist from a news outlet, and he told me that his most read piece from the whole of the year wasn't one of the many rugby articles that he wrote. It was about Billy Vunipola getting tasered in Mallorca by the police. And that kind of is a perfect example of, I suppose, what the point I'm trying to make, which is bad news makes great news, and people are attracted to bad news. And I think that, and newspapers understand that negative news sells better on the whole. And I think that there are kind of eye scanning experiments, that have been done that prove that people look for negative words. They will migrate to negative words more than looking for positive words. So in many ways, newspapers are kind of selling to the audience, selling to their customer, if you see what I mean. But of course, it does frustrate, because I think there are lots of times when there are some, really, positive and fun stories that potentially get not overlooked, but less attention, because of what I've just summarised, really.
The only reason I smiled when you mentioned that story is because originally I thought that I might have been the journalist in question who said that to you, because I remember.
Did you write that story then?
I remember writing that story for the Telegraph, and yes, when it came to the kind of end of year
your numbers
review where you totted up the numbers to see what had performed well, it wasn't your beautiful kind of 2,000 word feature on whatever it was. Yes, it was Billy Vunipola getting tasered. So that was why a smile came to my face.
That rings true with you then, doesn't it? If you
Yes, it does. Yeah. So I wasn't smiling at the image of Billy Vunipola getting tasered. I was smiling because I could relate to what you were saying.
Does that ring true though? I've made that statement, but does that is that do you think do you agree with that?
Yeah. Yes, no, I do. There's an acceptance that I think realistically the news cycle tends to be dominated by negative stories or stories that slant that way, and that tends to be why if I try to think about if you rush to turn on the news or rush to read a website or a newspaper, most of the time, if it's a big breaking news story, it's not going to be a positive news story. It's because you're going to want to know what's happened and why, because it kind of taps into that kind of negative side of the brain. So no, it does slant true. It is, definitely something I can agree with you on as a journalist as well. You've got a great section in the book on mind games, and obviously this plays a huge part in top level sport, or rather people love talking about mind games as if it is a big part of the sport. So I wondered if you could just unpack that and some of the kind of highlights that you heard about when you were putting the book together.
Yeah, so I argue in the book that there's kind of 5 themes for mind games, 5 different themes, and which are chest beating, targeting, kidology, reverse psychology, and something I basically sum up as kind of flexing and baiting. And they've all got their own, different examples, and I try and explore those a bit. And basically, the reason that coaches do them first and foremost is for a performance advantage. That's why they're doing it. It's not a diversionary tactic. Sometimes it can be a diversionary tactic, but most of the time it's to try and gain a performance advantage. And I think that's an important point to make. And when I was kind of researching that chapter, there was some kind of nice anecdotes, and probably the nicest anecdote was in the reverse psychology section. I spoke to Tony Pulis, who was brilliant, absolutely, really thought-provoking, like really, really interesting guy to talk to, and clearly someone who thought a lot about his approach to media. And I learned a lot from him. And he basically told me that he when he was manager at Stoke, the first couple of years, he did use that kind of the world's against us reverse psychology to try and galvanise his teams for a performance. But then in his third season, because Stoke had done quite well, and I think they'd finished, top 10 and 8th or whatever, the club were no longer getting that kind of, they weren't getting, like criticised, or people expected them to do well, and there was this expectation for them to actually knock sides over. And he just said, in my third season, I kind of ran out of that stuff that I couldn't say. So he just walked into the change room, and more often than not, he would just make stuff up to say, oh, have you seen what their manager says, or have you seen this article? They've said this, and just it'd be completely fabricated. And I just love that story, which is, is a kind of canny operator trying to kind of galvanize his charges. I just loved it. So yeah, it's a really interesting part of the role. Not many kind of coaches go there. But those who do, it's a kind of risk and reward game, and it's very much a kind of double-edged sword. And then for you guys in the media, it's obviously great. And for people, supporters, because they can, they're great talking points ahead of big games, aren't
they? There must have been moments, and you won't have to name specific examples, but where you've sort of been sat in those press conferences or in those media huddles where maybe you're internally raising your eyebrows potentially at something that a coach has said, or just wondering how it might play out. I imagine that must have happened a few times over the years.
Yeah, I mean, the best, I obviously worked for Eddie Jones, who could be very, very good at it. And Eddie himself, when I spoke to him about it, he will freely admit that he didn't get it right every time. But there are certainly times when he does get this stuff right, and you can see that, perhaps some of this stuff has had an effect on the team's performance. I remember probably the most famous one is, on the subject of reverse psychology is, in the 2019 World Cup game, England were due to play the All Blacks in 2019, and he walked into the press conference and he says, right, who thinks we've got a chance of winning? And before anyone's even got a chance to I think he says, raise your hands if think we've got a chance of winning. Before anyone's got a chance to hold their hands up, he says, look, no one thinks we can win. No one gives us a chance. And of course, that was clipped up, and of course that, in my mind, and I wasn't there, but in my mind, that was purely for the benefit of his team, to say ahead of this final, no, everyone's written you off. No one gives you a chance. Let's go and show them it's us versus the world. And he was, he could be an absolute master of that, as could Mourinho and others. But when you sit in press conferences like that, sometimes you kind of know it's happening, and you just have to admire it for, what it is.
Yeah, very good. Oh, Tim, it's been great to hear about the book. Before I let you go, can I just get you to tell me what is the best one-liner that you've heard from a coach in one of those situations?
Best one-liner. Well, let's stay with Tony Pulis, who in that same chapter on kind of criticism, controversy, he said to me, I love this. He said when he was a young manager, he was told that you're always in the poo. But he doesn't use the word poo, something a little bit stronger. And he says, you're always in the poo. You're either ankle deep, knee deep, or up to the neck in it. And I just loved that, because it does kind of give an example of, top flight coaches, you do feel like that sometimes, where, you're kind of always up against it, but it just depends what level you're there. But you're never quite, free of everything. And I love that. I thought it was just a nice one liner.
Good, and thank you for refraining. This is a family show after all.
Yeah,
so
it's not before the watershed.
I appreciate that's very true. I appreciate that, Tim. I also appreciate you taking the time. Let's see the book one more time.
Okay.
Marvelous.
Available at all good bookshops.
On the record and on the ball, how elite coaches master the media. Tim Percival, thank you very much. What a pleasure.
Oh, you're very welcome. Cheers, Ben. See you soon.
Hope you enjoyed that, everyone. Just a quick request to please like, share and subscribe. It does make a massive difference when we're trying to get this off the ground. And also, if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please drop me a message on any of the social networks or drop me an email down below. We'd love to have a conversation. We'll see you on Friday. Goodbye.